And we are at the Cold War in America. So, this unit is, there's a lot of stuff to talk about. So, I felt like the easiest thing to do would be to divide it by decades. So, we're going to talk about things like the movement for women's rights, civil rights, what's happening in the economy, what's happening with our relationships with countries across the world. But we're going to do it by decades. So, hopefully, that is going to be the least confusing way to do it. There's a lot of facts, so take a lot of good notes. So here we go. All right, so you guys probably already know the Cold War defined is basically us versus the Soviet Union. So we're both terrified on either side that communism is going to infect us like a disease. And on the communist side, they're saying the same thing about the idea of capitalism. So we both see each other as evil. And truly, honestly, the United States and the Soviet Union are really basically the two countries left standing after World War II. We didn't get a lot of infrastructure destruction, so we're not rebuilding anything. And we actually have extra money where other countries are really struggling to bring themselves back together and stand on their own 2 feet without our financial help. So, or without Stalin's financial help, because Stalin also gave countries money hoping that they would turn communist, and they did. And so when the dust settles of who's going to be what, it comes down to us versus the Soviet Union and Stalin. Scary, scary thought, right? All right, so I told you we're going to do it by decades. Let's start with the women's movement of the 1950s. Hold on, boys, you're going to love this. All right, so let's define feminism. I want you to take a minute and think about it in your own head. What do you think feminism is? And I love both of these posters here. Feminism encourages women to leave their husbands, kill their children, practice witchcraft, destroy capitalism, and become lesbians. And that was said by Pat Robertson, who was a really famous religious leader during this time. So feminism is evil. If you're a feminist, you hate all men. None of that's true. The real truth behind feminism is just this: women want equality, and men want women to have equality too, right, guys? So it's just equality in everything, whether it's politics or society itself or the economic sphere. Even today, if you don't know this, women still make 73 cents for every dollar a man makes. And if you're a black woman, it's 67 cents. So, am I a feminist? Heck yeah. I think everybody should be paid their worth, not their gender. So, okay, I won't get on a soapbox, I promise. Let's just keep going. All right, so the very first wave of feminism, we have to go back to the ladies that first started to say we want rights. And the first thing that they really stood together on was suffrage. So we want the right to vote. And then they came together with the idea of temperance. If men are not behaving themselves when they drink, then let's just get rid of alcohol. So the temperance movement became a really big deal. And then, of course, women do want property rights. Divorce was something that really destroyed a woman's life. If you divorced your husband, he owned everything, including your children. And women are starting to say, no, I have rights too, and I should be able to own property. So the key event for this one is, of course, guess it, guess it, guess it. That's right, Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. So this was the first wave of feminism. You look at this picture and you look at those ladies, and in the modern idea of what a feminist is, they don't look like feminists, but they are, because remember, feminism just means we want equality. We want equality for everybody. That's what feminism is. So it starts way back in 1848 at the Seneca Falls Convention. And out of that, we end up getting, of course, the 19th Amendment passed in 1920. Notice I said that very carefully because you better know that. All right, so 19th Amendment, you should also know who wrote it. Who wrote it? Susan B. Anthony. Very good. I know you said it with me, right? All right, so let's look at the ladies' role in World War One and World War Two. They definitely in both wars realized that there were new opportunities and experiences in the workforce, convinced these ladies that they did not need a man. Much more World War Two than World War One. So they found confidence in themselves as individuals and realized that they could do things that they had always been told they could not do. They could actually truly do the job of a man, and they could truly take care of themselves. So, World War II, again, much more than World War One, offered women this opportunity to show their worth to society, that they weren't just these pretty faces, they weren't just baby makers. They could actually go out and make a difference. They could build things just like men. So, this is a whole new role for women. Now, after World War One, the women will very quietly go back home and become, housewives and mothers again. But after World War II, no, 75% of the women are saying, we will not go home. 75% said, I refuse to leave. So if men need my job, too bad, move on. You're just going to have to find another job. That's a really big deal in 1950s society. All right, so let's see what society itself is telling these ladies who do not want to go home. They're telling these ladies that the core of who you are is right here in front of you: motherhood and marriage. Motherhood and marriage. And that is what your general life is all about. Your house should be spotless. Your children should be perfect. You will vacuum in high heels and a dress and makeup. Your husband will never see you grumpy or out of energy. Women will turn to taking drugs they call pep pills. It was actually caffeine pills. And they would do it to the point where it hurt them, but they needed to be peppy. That's why they called them pep pills. They're supposed to be peppy and happy for their husband. And everything was supposed to be about you being that perfect wife and that perfect mother. Now, education for women in the 1950s didn't stop. Many women went to college, but the truth of it is that many women went to college looking for a husband. And so we ended up getting this crazy degree called the Mrs. degree. It wasn't actually a degree, it was a joke. And men would say, oh, yeah, my daughter's going to college to get her Mrs. degree, which really meant she was going to look for a husband. Now, are women actually graduating with degrees? Yes, they are, but not in massive numbers. Most of them do find a husband in college, and then that's the end of their college education. Now, the dress I already told you about. Women are supposed to be perfect. They wore dresses. You can see in the picture that the lady, she has high heels on, and you can see her calf. That was kind of the way of the world too. This is where you first start to see that Barbie figure emerge. That women are supposed to be shaped like Barbie, who, by the way, if she was a real woman in real life proportions, she wouldn't be able to stand up because her breast would be too large. So, but this is the figure that they're promoting to women in the 1950s. So women again are doing things that are harmful to their bodies to get that tiny, tiny waist. Now, big hips were okay because that meant that you were healthy and able to bear children well. If you have big hips, that's what people believed. So you had these dresses that fit you tight at the waist to show your tiny little waist, and then they flared out to make your hips look even bigger than they were, again because that meant that you could have kids, lots of kids. Women are doing they are doing jobs, but we're talking secretarial jobs. Some nurses, sure, absolutely, even though the war is over. Some teachers in the 1950s, yes, but you're not going to do a manly kind of teaching job. Like you're definitely not going to do math because you're not smart enough. You're not going to do history because you're not smart enough. Definitely not going to do anything to do with physical stuff like PE. A woman's never going to be a coach at a school or anything like that. So jobs and income are still kind of set for women, the nurse, the teacher, the secretary. You do have some that stayed in the factories. I don't want you to think that they kicked them all out and locked the door, but predominantly women are going to be kind of those menial jobs. Secretary is a big one. And then birth control, of course, the pill was not legal yet in the 1950s. You were not supposed to take anything that prevented you from getting pregnant because your role in society was as a baby maker in the 1950s. You should have children. And so women were not permitted to talk about birth control. It was kind of a dirty talk. You're not allowed to talk about it, and you shouldn't be practicing it either. So women weren't even supposed to enjoy sex during this time period. You're never supposed to initiate it with your husband, but you're never supposed to refuse him when he's in the mood. So it's all about having children. Sexual relationships is all about having children. So why in the world would you ever talk about birth control? That's a big, big no-no. And the media of the day, of course, is directed at women. Women are the targets for everything. In the 1950s, the media swarm was over things that would make women's lives easier. So you're talking about things to clean your house, like the vacuum cleaner, dishwashers, that kind of stuff. Washing machines, new washing machines. So it's all directed at women for keeping your house clean, or how can you make your hair more beautiful, or how can you be more full of energy for your husband. There were lots of how to's on how to be the perfect wife, lots of articles on that kind of stuff. So women really are the target of media in the 1950s, and it was all targeted at getting them back home, back into the kitchen, and pregnant. They didn't have to be barefooted if they didn't want to be, but they needed to be pregnant, and that's the media of the day. All right, so we're going to move on to civil rights of the 1950s. So we're still in the 1950s, but we're just going to move on to a different subject. The civil rights movement really starts in 1954 with the Supreme Court case Brown v. Board. Now, Brown was a little girl named Linda Brown, and Linda Brown was a black child who lived in a neighborhood where she had to walk past a very nice white school to get to her not very nice black school. And the black school was quite a ways from her home as well. So she would go to this environment every day where the roof, if it rained too hard, you couldn't hold school because the roof leaked. It was cold. They didn't have books. They didn't have chairs. These kids, the chairs that you think about in a schoolroom now where you have a place to put your books, like nowadays it's under your desk. Desk and chairs for black schools were not even designed that way because everybody knew they wouldn't have books. So why waste the money to add a shelf or a cubby here or there on your desk or your chair when it's never going to be used? I mean, that's how bad it was and how obvious it was. So Linda Brown's parents decided to do something about it. And it wasn't just the Brown family, it was many families rolled up all in one who are going to bring this case to the Supreme Court. But it starts with Linda Brown and her family, and so it's named for them. Now, of course, the topic is all about school segregation. Make sure you know that word associated with Brown v. Board. And the lawyers that they ended up hiring are two fantastic lawyers, both black individuals, Oliver Hill and Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall will actually go on to be a Supreme Court judge later, and he does some incredible things. So we'll talk about him much more in the future. But Thurgood and Oliver both decided that they were going to dedicate all their time to this. They both ended up having financial problems because of it. Thurgood actually filed bankruptcy. He lost his wife. They were doing pretty well until this case came along, and they dropped everything to fight this case for years. And to them, though, it was worth it. I mean, this was the case that was going to change the situation for the black community in America, and they knew it. And so, of course, they end up winning. They overturned that separate but equal doctrine that we talked about, feels like 1,000 years ago, Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. So make sure you know that the segregation starts with Plessy versus Ferguson, and it's supposed to die with Brown v. Board in 1954. And that's not to say that every school overnight is going to say, oh, let's get rid of that segregation, that evil segregation. That's not going to happen. But on the law books, after 1954, it is illegal to segregate children in schools across America. So there is, of course, going to be massive resistance in the South, and that's what a whole lot of this unit is going to be about. And it's not just in the 50s, it's going to continue on for decades. All right, so let's talk about a lady you all already know, probably, Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks is another spark that ignites this idea of not segregating different parts of America, and she's going to focus on the bus system in Montgomery, Alabama. So the buses there are segregated. Black individuals had to sit in the back. If there were too many whites, blacks had to actually get off or sit on top of each other. It was all about making the whites comfortable, and if the blacks didn't fit, they didn't fit. Now, Rosa Parks belonged to a group called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and it was a church-based organization, which means it was all about peace. Martin Luther King was also part of this group that came together to discuss how to make change. And it was decided well in advance that Rosa Parks would get on a bus and she would put herself in a situation where she was asked to move, and she was going to refuse and allow herself to be arrested. So probably in kindergarten or first or second grade, your teacher probably told you, oh, she was an old woman, she was tired, she refused to get up, and it turned into this big giant thing. That's not at all what happened. And that, I'm not trying to take away from what Rosa did. I'm adding to it. Rosa knew what she was going to do that day, and knowing it, that she was putting herself in a very dangerous situation where she could be hurt or maybe even killed. But she did it anyway. Now, why would Martin Luther allow her to do it instead of a man? There were a lot of reasons. Number one, she is a woman. And so if you arrest this woman and you make sure that she looks tidy and neat, and this little tiny woman, and they did purposely make her look older. She was only in her 30s, but they made her look older. So they wanted it to look like the police were picking on this poor, sweet lady. That's not going to work if you use a man. They also thought that it was less likely that there would be violence because it's a woman and not a man. And so they planned this very, very carefully. And Rosa did it. She said yes. So she got on the bus. Of course, you know the story. The police will arrest her. Her mug shot shows this. She looks like a sweet little old lady in the picture. And it really did get the masses involved in it. And so no blacks rode the bus system in Montgomery, Alabama. They all boycotted the bus system. So, of course, she's arrested in 1955, and from that day forward, no blacks are using the bus system. Montgomery, Alabama is predominantly black. That bus system was making tons of money off of the black community, and now it's gone. It's all gone. So, it only takes just a little smidgen over a year before they decided that they would officially desegregate all the buses in Montgomery, Alabama. Now, this is just in Montgomery, Alabama, true, but it made a spark to ignite that kind of discussion and that kind of change across America. So what Rosa Parks did that day does definitely change the way that we look at the race relations, at least on the transportation system. But it's wider, it's a bigger picture than that. But Rosa Parks, very, very brave woman, even braver than you may have ever thought she was. So speaking of bravery, the black community is going to have to really find their bravery in this situation, because the southern people are going to resist. They're going to do things, especially on where the schools are concerned. They're going to do things like white flight, which means that they are going to pull their children out of school. They're going to buy a second home that is in an all white community. Their kids will go to school there, and then in the summertime they will come back to the family home. So white people just picked up and left so that their children would not have to be segregated with black children. Some schools were officially shut down and rebuilt in places where the black community had no access. They didn't have a way to get their kids there, but the white people did. So devious things. They also, we've been talking about private schools since the start of America, these religious schools that opened up. But now you have this giant swarm of private schools that have nothing to do with religion. It's just private because if it's privately owned, they get to decide who walks through that door and who does not. And of course, there were no black children walking through the door of white academies. It was not going to happen. So there was massive resistance to this segregation or desegregation of public schools, just like there was with the buses, the lunch counters, everything. There's always going to be resistance to it. So the biggest example that we can think of as far as the bravery of the black community is it fell on the shoulders of 9 high school children, and they are now in history called the Little Rock Nine. And in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, these children decided that they were going to to be brave, definitely brave, and they were going to march themselves to school. And so, of course, people lined the sidewalks and they said horrible things to them. The local authority said that they were going to block the door, they were not going to let them in. And so the President of the United States said, no, 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 we are not doing this. And he sent in 1,000 troops to make sure that these kids were fully escorted to school and nothing happened to them. Now, that doesn't mean that they were treated well. They were allowed through the door, but these military guys are not going to follow them around. The kids are still going to be stared at and glared at, and mean things will be said to them as they're walking to the school. But once they got in, one of the guys, and I'm going to give you a website here in a minute that you can go to, and you can see an interview with one of the Little Rock Nine, and he said, just changing classes, like you got beat up changing classes. But all nine of them do graduate from Central High School in Little Rock. So these children were very brave, and it was very, very public because of the military having to be called in. So I'm going to give you the web address, and no, you're not going to be able to cut and paste. You're going to have to actually freeze the video and type it in. But it's worth it. So do it. I mean, just to see the things that they did to the kids and the looks on the people's faces is looks of hatred towards the children. It should give you at least a little bit of an idea of how brave the Little Rock Nine really were. So here it is. Freeze it, freeze it, freeze it, type it in, go see the video. All right, so that all being done in the 1950s, we're going to continue on with another topic, culture and the economy of the 1950s. Woohoo! This is going to be a good one. So the war is over, and guess what? Our economy is super, super strong. We're going to increase defense spending, which sounds weird because the war is over. But remember, we're in the middle of the Cold War, so we're going to increase defense spending with the thought that the communists are coming to take us over. The Bretton Woods system was developed, and under that, we created a World Bank, a place that countries could go to in times of need. Remember, you've got half the world rebuilding from devastation of World War II, and so lots of countries are going to need money. We also created, through the Bretton Woods system, the IMF, which is still an important entity today. If you have a natural disaster, a flood, hurricane, then you go to the IMF and you can get money as long as you have paid something in. So it's kind of like an insurance program where if you pay so much a year or so much a month, and in times of need and devastation, the IMF will give you loans. So they also froze exchange rates across the world so that nobody was bullying anybody else on the exchange rate market. We were giving loans to other countries. The IMF was giving loans to other countries. And so, if you remember, the United States is really the reason that the world fell into this deep depression in the 1930s. And here we are bringing everybody out of that depression. So we're undoing those mistakes that we made in the 1930s through the Bretton Woods system with the World Bank and IMF. All right, so it is a consumer culture, definitely, definitely after the war. Remember, the War Board had forced all these industries to stop producing whatever they produced at the time before the war, and they had to start producing only war goods. So you couldn't buy anything during World War II because nothing new was being made. But now the war is over, and all the factories are going back to producing consumer goods, and there's tons of them. TV is a big, big one, and you see all the little gadgets and appliances here in the picture for the ladies because we want people buying stuff. We want the economy to keep getting healthy, and we can't be healthy if people aren't spending. So advertising became the thing of the day, and of course, you know that advertising, like I told you before, is aimed at women in the 1950s. Well, it's always aimed at women, to be honest. Women hold the purse strings. So, but in the 1950s, like we said before, it's all about those gadgets that will make you a better wife and make your life as a wife, a housewife, easier. So a lot of critics said that this advertising through TV and media was going to make everybody conform, and we would all be alike. So some critics said we're going to lose our individuality and our individual identities if we start paying attention to this advertising and we all buy the same things and we all wear the same clothes. And so some people, of course, did not like that. So we get something called cookie cutter houses. And again, this is that conforming kind of thing where all the houses look exactly alike. They're made by very cheap products called ticky tacky. So you sometimes heard them called as ticky tacky houses. But the cookie cutter houses are literally, it's the same house over and over and over again. The only difference might be the color. And again, this is rejected by those conformists. Now, the guy that started that created towns called Levittown, a town called Levittown in New York. His name was William Levitt, and he's the one that designed those suburbs with the cookie cutter houses. You could fit a lot of people into a very small space. It was easy and cheap to make the houses because they were all identical. You didn't have to pay anybody to do new plans for a new kind of house. All you had to do was buy a different color paint once in a while. So it became very popular. The FHA was developed so that middle class people could get a loan through the government to buy a home, and the interest rates are low. It's FHA is still around today. It's kind of hard to get a loan through them. The houses that your house has to be pretty much perfect. When you buy it for the FHA to approve it. But sometimes it's worth the pain in the butt with all the paperwork because it is really good interest rates through the FHA. Now, minorities are going to be excluded from the suburbs. Minorities are still living in the cities, very often not in very good situations. They are not. Most minorities are not at the level where they could have a car that could take them out to the suburbs, and they're definitely not going to be welcome in the suburbs, even if they could buy a house and find a way there. All right, so let's talk about the youth. You guys know we talked about this before that once cars were prevalent, teenagers didn't have to have those dates on the front porch, mommy and daddy staring out the window, flicking the light when it's time to come in. Now they have cars and they have freedom and they can pick up and they can go places. And so children definitely start to change. And rock and roll is the thing of the day. It rejects conformity. These songs are crazy. Parents thought that the kids were all going to go to hell, and what was happening to the United States, we're falling apart. And one of the guys that's blamed for this is Elvis. So you see Elvis up here, Elvis the pelvis. Elvis took black music and black moves and introduced them in his singing. To be honest with you, his singing's not that fantastic. It was his performance. So I'll put a couple clips up, or the web addresses to some clips if you want to go in and look at these three guys that I have here, and I'll introduce you to the other two here in a minute. But if you want to look at the clips, it'll give you I think it's a top 10 Elvis moves, and talks about the curled lip and the Elvis the pelvis and all that. But he was so super popular with both the white and the black community, not community, I guess you could say, mostly teenagers. Girls fainted when the man walked in the room. He was that big of a deal. But he took the moves and the music that the black community had been using, and he morphed it into his own. So it's kind of sexual, and people went crazy for that. So the black community will borrow from his ideas. So he's kind of that liaison between black and white when it came to dance and music, and that is what made him so popular. They even let the guy act in some movies. He was a horrible actor, but there were quite a few movies out with Elvis in it, and of course they were all musicals. But he like I said, he didn't sing that great in my opinion, and he definitely was not a good actor, but he was the guy of the day. Now, oh, and here I have again. Sorry, I didn't click it soon enough. He influences black artists. He influences the white people. The black community has key characters too that will influence everybody. And Little Richard, you see him blowing a kiss here. He is such a character. You really need to watch the clip with him in it. It is Muhammad Ali's birthday, and he was asked to perform for him, and it's very funny. But you also get to see how amazingly talented this guy was. And then, of course, we can't talk about the 1950s without Chuck Berry, Johnny Be Good. If you are a Back to the Future fan, you've probably heard that song there because he's going back into the 50s, and so Chuck Berry was the guy of the day. So I'm gonna create another page, and you'll go right into it, freeze it, and cut, or you can't cut and paste, sorry, freeze it and type the web addresses in if you would like to hear some of the fantastic music of the 1950s. So here they are, kiddies. I know it's a pain in the butt to type this in, but I promise you it is worth it to see these actors and musicians and dancers and artists do their thing. So life's short. You should experience as much as you possibly can. So take a minute and type in these web addresses, and I will see you on the next topic. All right, so more reactions to conformity. You can't get more reaction than the Beat Generation. These are writers who did, you could call it poetry, but it was really more like talking. Didn't have to rhyme at all. They got up in front of audiences or each other, and they would click their fingers and talk to the beat, or you would have some kind of funky little music very lightly played in the background, and mostly it was depressing, I'm not gonna lie. And this guy right here is the king of the Beat Generation. His name is Jack Kerouac, and Jack Kerouac went on the road literally. Here's his pilgrimage map. You can still do it today and trace him, and along that path you'll see all kinds of things about Jack Kerouac sat here, slept here, ate here, whatever. But he wrote a book about his travels, and it's called On the Road. He was considered part of the counterculture revolution with that beatnik or beat generation. And truly his stuff was just depressing. He starts out most of his stuff with, somebody's dead, or we're all gonna die, or but he's saying he's trying to get out of that conformity, that he doesn't want to conform. He wants to be an individual. He just does it in a really depressing way, but he was super popular. Everybody had a copy of On the Road and Jack Kerouac. I guess he just kind of seemed like a hero. He didn't have a job. He traveled from town to town. He entertained people. He got people to think, and just a very different character. And for some reason, everybody forgets Jack Kerouac when it's time to take a test on this unit. So don't forget Jack on the road. All right, so we can't talk about the 1950s without talking about religion. Remember, we're fighting communism, and so it became the godless communists versus God-fearing America. Now, does that mean that all communists were atheists? No, but Stalin is the one that said that religion is no longer allowed in the Soviet Union, and so it kind of became that if you were communist, people believed that you were probably godless. And we are finding God again in the 1950s after the war. Life is good. People want to keep it that way, and so they turn to God. And you start seeing phrases like "In God We Trust" on our money. We add the phrase "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. It didn't exist in there before, and we started seeing characters on television and on the radio that were called televangelists. And Billy Graham was the top televangelist, and he ends up becoming spiritual advisor for many presidents, from Truman to Obama. And he really does bring religion back to the United States. And it's still a separation of church and state. We're not backing financially any specific faith or church, but we're starting to say it's okay to have religion in things like our money and in our pledge. They will also paint the Congressional Hall with religious toned pictures for the first time, and this is very heavily influenced by Billy Graham. So Billy Graham died 2018, February 2018, and he was in his 90s. I believe he was 99. So of course he was not Trump's religious advisor. He was too old, but very influential religious leader. All right, so let's get into Cold War politics in the 1950s. You just can't wait to hear what I'm going to say about this. So it all starts, of course, at the Yalta Conference, and we have Churchill, FDR, and Stalin sitting here, FDR in the middle, and they meet at Yalta. And they discuss, even before the war is over, because it's only February of 1945, they're discussing what they're going to do after the war is over, and specifically, what are they going to do to and for Germany. And it is decided that Germany would be divided into four zones, with Russia getting the largest one, and then America, France, and Britain splitting the other half of it. So they thought giving Stalin the biggest portion would make him happy, but it did not. So tense feelings were already starting to be developed at that Yalta conference with the big three, and so we decided, and as historians, that that is truly where the Cold War started. It started at Yalta. Every idea that they put on the table, Stalin was negative about it, and it was already very obvious that he was not going to play nice. So it gets even worse when France and Britain come to America after all this is said and done, and the war is over, and they're starting to rebuild and realize, oh my gosh, we cannot take care of a bunch of Germans. We can't feed them. And so their portions of Germany ends up going to the United States, which makes it even worse because now we have a giant portion of the country of Germany, and Stalin has a smaller one. And Stalin's a big guy, and he thinks that he should have the biggest portion of every pie there is. So I only put this up because if you're doing some of the readings that go along with this time period, you might hear these terms: Western Bloc and Eastern Bloc. So the Western Bloc is everything in blue, it's non-communist. Eastern Bloc is everything you see in red, and of course red means communism. So those are your communist nations. That's all you need to know. Just know the terms: Western Bloc, Eastern Bloc, no K at the end. NATO was also developed during this time period. Hopefully, you remember that from previous studies. But NATO is the guns of the United Nations, and we had during the League of Nations there were no guns, and so the League of Nations didn't really have any real authority. So we're not going to make that same mistake twice. The League of Nations is dissolved, the United Nations is created. America will join this time, of course, and we create NATO to protect non communist countries. And so, of course, the communists are going to have to come up with their own organization, and their organization to protect communism becomes known as the Warsaw Pact. And now we come to Truman. Poor Truman, of course, is the man who was left with the decision to drop the bombs on Japan and end the war. And now the guy has to deal with communism. And so he comes to the realization and announces it to the public that we can't kill it. It's too powerful. We can't kill it, but we must contain it. We can't allow it to grow. And so that became known as the Truman Doctrine of Containment. Whatever it takes, we got to contain it. So if you wanted help to resist communist advances, America was there, and it came in the form of military aid, financial aid, whatever you need. Just don't turn communist is basically the message that Truman gave the world. So the financial part of it becomes known as the Marshall Plan. And again, this is part of that Truman Doctrine of Containment. The Marshall Plan is basically the idea that we will give you money, we will give you food, just don't turn communist. And of course, it was done by George Marshall. You probably, hopefully, remember him as the guy who really planned D-Day with Eisenhower. But Marshall was the mastermind behind it. How do we get that many forces in one spot without killing one another? So he was a mastermind. So he is called upon to come up with a plan to keep countries from turning communist, and it is named after him, the Marshall Plan. And it ends up being $13 billion in aid to Europe. And you can see the map down here, who got what. Britain got the most. France came in second. You need to know at least those two. But we also helped Greece and Turkey and Switzerland, and anybody that asked us for any kind of help, we were there. So what our goal was is this that you see in front of you: to stabilize and rejuvenate Western Europe. Are we doing this because we are great guys? No, we're doing it, number one, of course, to contain communism, make sure nobody else turns communist, but we're also doing it because we need trading partners, and we need these countries that are suffering to become healthy again so that we can stay on top and make lots of money. And so yes, we're willing to give them whatever they need. And again, it's not just money. When we say aid, it's also food and other supplies. So that's what this other picture here is. So Marshall Plan, policy of containment, Truman's policy of containment, all go hand in hand. All right, so of course, Russia is not going to take any of this lightly, and so hopefully, that Berlin was cut in half. Berlin was with the eastern side being communist under Soviet control, and the western side being non-communist. Well, Stalin didn't like it. I told you he was really upset that America has such a large portion of the country of Germany, and so he decides that he's not going to allow us to have any of Berlin. And so he set up military troops all around the western side of Berlin and said, "You're not coming in." And he was planning on starving the people on the western side, the non-communist people in Berlin. And so we, of course, can't allow that to happen. And so we do something called the Berlin airlift. It's the Berlin crisis. The people are starving, and we do a Berlin airlift. And basically, it's a food drop. So after the Soviet blockade of West Berlin, we cannot allow him to do this. Like, you can't. I mean, it's the spread of communism, number one, which goes against the containment policy, but you can't back down to Stalin either. If Stalin sees any weakness in anybody, boy, he's right after you for that. So we combined forces with the United Kingdom to do this airlift. They donated things too, supplies and food, and as you see, we just dropped it from planes. Things got really, really serious between the Soviet Union and the United States, and we were actually threatening him with war. If you don't back off, we have tons of weapons. We'll come after you. And so finally, we come up with the idea of Operation Vittles. This isn't just an airlift and food drop. We're bringing bombers with us. We're bringing nuclear weapons with us. And so we have planes already ready to go, loaded with all this scary stuff. And who's to say we won't just keep on flying and fly right over Russia? And so with that threat, he decided to remove the Soviet blockade and allow us back into Western Berlin. And that line, once again, between East and West, it will be the Berlin Wall. So, but it took that Operation Vittles with a threat of bombers and nuclear weapons to get Stalin to back off. All right, so back home in America, we are going through our second wave of the Red Scare, and you should know that that is the fear of communism, and it is Joseph McCarthy who is the one who really causes this second wave to be as radical and widespread as it was. Now, he was elected to the Senate in 1946, and he really wanted to make a plan for himself. Most people believe that he was vying for the presidency. So he has to do something to make a name for himself, and it comes in the form of the Red Scare. So in 1950, he claimed that he knew personally of 205 communists who were in the State Department alone. And he was so convincing that he was allowed to create HUAC, which is a committee that came together and pointed fingers at people and put them on trial to decide if they were communist or not. So it got so crazy that they blacklisted people. Many of them are really super famous people from public appearances. Lucille Ball was one of them. She married a Cuban. Ricky Ricardo was a Cuban, and she married him. So she must automatically be a communist. So even as popular as she was in the 1950s, she was not allowed to make any movies, commercials, be seen in public as like a public figure. So she was totally blacklisted. She's just one of many. We also went as far as to put Alger Hiss on trial in 1950. Now, Alger Hiss helped create the United Nations. He was not a communist or a communist sympathizer, but McCarthy convinced people that he was. He needed a big name to go down, and Alger Hiss was the guy. He had it out for him, so this was going to make his claim to fame, that he brought down the evil Alger Hiss, and I'm using quotation marks. I know you can't see me, but believe me, I am. And he said, this is what's going to make me famous. So the man is sentenced to 10 years in prison. Now, he only serves 3 because this wave is going to finally die off, and people are going to be like, oh, sorry, Alger, we didn't mean it. And they set him free. But of course, the damage is done. He's never going to forgive America for turning on him. And in return, Americans stay suspicious of the guy. And he didn't do anything. But putting Alger in prison was not enough. We had to kill a couple people too, and that came in the form of a couple, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They were Russians, and they were part of the Communist Party, and they left Russia. They wanted a better life. They were scientists, and so when they came to America, they joined our weapons program and started helping us to build atomic weapons. So, of course, they seem super suspicious, right? So, he's going to bring them to trial. And they are actually found guilty of being spies and sentenced to die in 1951. And we went through with it. We electrocuted the couple in 1953. So, that's how savage it got. And this was all on the word of Joseph McCarthy and nothing more. So here's his major targets. And again, it's all about making him popular. So he's going to look for big names. So like I said, the government people, Alger Hiss, entertainment people, Lucille Ball, educators were highly looked at because he said, they're the ones responsible for molding the minds of our youth. And if you get a communist in there, oh my God, it's a disease, and all the kids will catch it. They'll all be little commies. And so labor union people, of course, were taken down. It just it got crazy, but it's big name people that he goes after. It's not little Johnny nobody. But this fear, this red scare, gets so crazy that, like, people are calling into the State Department saying, I think my dad's a communist, I think my neighbor's a communist, I'm pretty sure my boss is a communist. So lots of people were being put on trial just on the word of somebody. It got that crazy. All right, so Joseph Welch is the chief counsel for the U.S. Army, and McCarthy starts blaming a lot of higher up military people for being communists. And Joseph Welch is just done with this. He is so tired of it, and so he says, "Until this moment, Senator, I think I never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness." And of course, McCarthy comes back with, "Oh, you call me reckless? I'm not reckless. I'm saving the nation." And he goes on and on and on until Welch finally says, "Have you no decency, sir? Have you no decency?" And that episode between the recklessness accusation and the no decency accusation just does McCarthy completely in. So Joseph Welch is really the guy who brought down McCarthy, because of the things that he was willing to say publicly. He did it in the middle of a trial being filmed. And so that is going to be the downfall of McCarthy under the hands of Joseph Welch. And McCarthy kind of disappears. He ends up drinking himself to death in 1957, and the hearings are closed. Of course, Alger Hiss is brought out of prison. The Rosenbergs are dead. There's not a whole lot we can do about that. But McCarthy is gone, and McCarthyism is gone, and the Red Scare is gone. All right, so let's talk about some actual wars that took place during the Cold War. And of course, we have to talk about Korea. So, the Korean War is 1950 to 1953. Is it really? I'll come back to that. So, of course, it was after World War II, there was a huge fight for who would get Korea. It was one country at the time. And so everybody rushed to take it over. And the United States started in the south and worked our way northward. And Soviets worked their way from the south down. And we ended up meeting at the 38th parallel. And so Korea was now North Korea and South Korea, with the North being communist and the South being non-communist. So here you go, in case you didn't get that. There's Chinese, some, yeah, but in the beginning it was more Soviet. The Chinese will come in later in the north. And then in the south you have America and you have NATO occupation. So it's a military action now. We're not just saying, oh, okay, we'll stop at the 38th and we'll be friends. No, that's not what it was. It was an occupation, which means it wasn't friendly. And again, the 38th parallel, make sure you know that. 38, 38, 38. So in 1950, for whatever reason, unprovoked really, the North, communist North, invaded the South. And it was such a shock and so quickly done that before we could react, we actually almost lost South Korea. Do you see the city of Busan there in the far south? That little blue area is all that really was left of South Korea. They had pushed us that far and that fast. So it was approved by the United States that we should take action. Douglas MacArthur is the guy who was allowed to make the plan of how to go in there and push the communists back. We got to contain communism. The problem is that he was the commander and chief. Yes, all the stuff that he did in World War II. So he's looked at as a hero, but he is just sick of all of this. He's been in the Pacific for a long time, and he has a real negative attitude towards the Asian culture in general. And so he goes to Truman and asks if he could just nuke them all. Let's just nuke all of Korea. Be done with it. And of course, Truman said, no, 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 we have learned our lesson. We are not going to blow anybody else up. We've done enough. And of course, knowing MacArthur, he's not going to settle for no. And so he actually goes to the congressional floor over Truman's head, he thinks, to ask Congress to approve it. Let me blow these people up. And they said, no, thank you, and you're fired. And so he was removed from command. He was not dishonorably discharged. He had done too much good in the war, but he is removed from command. So with MacArthur gone, we still sent troops in. It wasn't just the United Nations; it was actually troops. Sorry, it wasn't just NATO. It was actual American troops that went in, and very, very, very quickly we pushed that line backwards until the point where North Korea almost disappeared. So you can see they're in pink. So very swift. We push them back. We think that we're going to win. We're going to take all of Korea. And who's going to come to the aid of North Korea? Most people think it's going to be the Soviets. It's not. It's actually China. So the Soviets are there. They're kind of watching, but we're really at war with China. We don't declare war on China. We don't declare war on Russia, but we are truly fighting Chinese and some Russians more than we're fighting Koreans. All right, so it is going to be a constant back and forth kind of thing there for a little while. And in the end, it is a stalemate, and we end up right back at the 38th parallel. So the effects, of course, are going to be permanent mobilization. We are still at war with Korea. We are still at war with Korea. That's what that means. So, a permanent mobilization, both sides. We are still at war with Korea. We have never settled it. Action stopped in 1953, but they're still mobilized for a fight if need be. So, no peace treaty, still at war on paper at least. And this is what the 38th parallel looks like today. So see the line, that concrete little bump going through the going on top of the ground there? That's the 38th parallel, and it goes into the buildings. So the buildings are divided, and the guards that you see, for first of all, the North Korean guards, they're only going to pick healthy guys, kind of the heavier men. And of course, they're not heavy because Koreans aren't, but these guys are the healthier of them. So America's supposed to believe that their people are healthy and well off, even though we know that they're not. But those men are put on the North Korean side really to watch one another more than they are to watch the Americans. The Americans aren't going to cross that line. Why would they want to come into North Korea? So that's not going to be an issue. The issue is North Koreans often want to run, and so they are standing there. Every man you see is standing there to watch another man to make sure they don't run, and if it looks like they're going to run, the order is to shoot them in the head. So now we do have people that sometimes need to meet in these buildings, and if you are a North Korean, you have to hold on to one another so that if one of you starts to run, the others can hold you back. Even sitting down at the table, they are supposed to be very wary of anybody that tries to put their hand over the line that runs down the table. And here's that line. It's just done with cords, but it's a line, and it's still the 38th parallel. So if you put your hand over that, then you're going to be in serious trouble. So they hold each other's hands going in, getting settled into the seats, and then they're seated. And look at the guy at the window. He's just waiting, and there's another man behind him waiting for one of these North Korean guys to make a move, and they will shoot them in the head. Crazy. Isn't that just crazy? So what's to keep people from going to another part of that along the 38th parallel and running? That building in that military zone is not going to keep everybody out, right? So we have something called the DMZ, and the DMZ is in some places it's as wide as 2 miles, but the DMZ is filled with landmines and water mines, and it was done by North Korea to seal her people in and seal the enemy out, and it's still kept up today. So you still, no matter where you are along that 38th parallel, unless you want to blow up, get yourself blown up, you're not going to cross that line. You're not going to. It's just it's active bomb still. Now, how do they know that? If you are sentenced to die in North Korea, your punishment is to walk the fields to make sure that the bombs are still active. And they have a map of where all the bombs are, of course. And if you walk over one and it doesn't blow you up, they know to dig it up and replace it with a good one. But you have to keep walking until they blow you up. That's pretty ingenious, really. It's horrible, but it's pretty ingenious. So we know the bombs are still active. All right, so back in America, Truman is finally going to be out of the picture, and we have Dwight D. Eisenhower. He's the first to use TV for campaign commercials. And he created this campaign called I Like Ike, I Like Ike, and people sang it as part of the commercial. It was a song, and it is a song that will drive you crazy. I like Ike, you like Ike, we all like Ike. So he increased spending on national security here at home. And one of the things that he did to do that was the Interstate Highway Act in 1956. He created a plan to connect us all, to make it so that it was easy to drive from coast to coast, not just get on a train or a plane, but drive across the United States. And in his mind, that would help us with defense. Now, he had been to Germany, and he saw the Autobahn and how fast they drove, and there were never accidents. But so in his mind, it was going to be this super fast speedway, and of course Americans can't handle that. So most of the people, by the time it was done, most people across America decided that 55 would be our speed limit, not 120 like the Autobahn. It takes 35 years to complete his portion of what he designed, and of course it's still being added to today. But I remember my mom freaking out when they announced officially that it was going to be 55 across America, and her saying that we were all going to die because 55 was way too fast. So now you've got 75, 80, 90 in some states, but we definitely are not as good at driving as the Germans are. So let's hope we never have an Autobahn, because I don't think we can handle it. But make sure you know that Ike is the guy that did the Interstate Highway Act. And if you look at it, Ike and interstate both start with I's. There you go. You're welcome. All right, so let's talk about some other things that Eisenhower did that really, really had an effect on America, and I'm sure that he had no idea what an effect it was going to have. But he created a program called Mutually Assured Destruction, and he helped America develop this vision of the Soviets. Some of them over there sitting in this dark room, and probably horns coming out of their head, and they have their fat finger hovering over a big red button, and if they push it, they'll set the bombs off to come and blow up America. But we have radar. And so we will see them coming in time to push our own red button and to kill the Soviets. So we'll blow up a few minutes before they will, but they're going to blow up too. So that's mutually assured destruction. What a pleasant thought. So America is really put on the platform of fear here. So the generation that grows up in Eisenhower's world definitely feels like none of us are ever going to grow up, and that goes into the 70s as well. That we are going to be blown up by the Soviets, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. And so he starts creating this massive nuclear buildup. And of course, for everything that we make, the Soviets make it. They make more, so we have to make more. And it's just this buildup that seems unstoppable. And the goal is to scare each other and possibly eventually kill each other. So these are the type of things that were developed in the 1950s: the hydrogen bomb, nuclear subs, ICBMs, which are those missiles that can really hit a target, a small target from very far away. Scary, scary, scary things. And those ICBMs are around until Reagan's time. So the Cold War is a pretty scary time for everybody. He also created something called the domino theory. And again, this has a fear factor associated with it. We saw all those satellite nations around the Soviet Union fall to communism right after World War II. And because of that, Eisenhower said that he believed in a domino theory, that when one country turns communist, every country around it turns communist. Again, it's like that disease, the theory that it's like a disease. And so when China turned communist, of course that is going to scare the crap out of us. So he's saying, we need to really look at the Asian world, because one after another these countries are falling under that domino effect. And so he scared us into thinking like it was this wave of communism coming to get us, working its way closer to us country by country. It's a scary picture. So he really is responsible for that nuclear buildup and those super cold feelings towards each other, the Soviet Union and the United States. All right, so it gets even crazier when the Soviet Union launches Sputnik in 1957. It's the first satellite into orbit, and we truly believe that this thing is so powerful that it can like see what we're doing in our houses and pick up conversations at the dinner table. And now everybody has to be super quiet and careful about anything they might know something about, that would help the Soviets. And so, of course, America freaks out and decides that we have to have our own program. And guess what's born? NASA! That's right. NASA is born in 1958, 1 year later, and the space race is on, baby. All right, so now we are done with the 1950s. We're going to move into the 1960s.